This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. At our first Speakers' Dinner of 2020, held on January the 22nd, we were delighted to host guest speaker retired Vice Admiral Mark Norman, former commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. Admiral Norman.
Since that time. So now, on top of all his other achievements, he can add RCMI member to his outstanding CV. I shall now pass the baton over to you, sir.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you. I do have some notes. I'm not sure I'm actually going to use them, but let me say a few introductory words, if I may. The first is the modern admiral's uniform. I'm not sure that the word modern describes the uniform, the admiral. We'll just leave it at that, and we won't focus on it. I stand with you tonight, humbled, conflicted, confused, and inspired. And if I am successful, I will address each of those emotions in due course. I am humbled because I never in a million years thought that I would be in the place that I'm in with my wife and family and supporters and friends. And I never really knew a lot about RCMI other than what I had heard, which was that it was a nice old place in downtown Toronto that was a bit stuffy, but you could get a decent meal. Or words to that effect. And here I stand speaking to you tonight. I'm conflicted because it was not long ago that I wore a uniform. And many in this room have retired at various stages in your life. Some of you have retired many times. Some of you are still serving. And I think it's fair to say that when you hang up the uniform, it's an emotional process, and there's a reaction. There's a series of reactions, and I'm conflicted because, in particular, as a senior officer, when serving, I had very strong opinions about retired officers and what they may or may not say. I will tell you now that those opinions have changed. I'll explore that further as I provide you my comments this evening. And confused because I'm not sure what you're expecting. I'm convinced that there was a secret email that went out offering 2-for-1 drink coupons or something else to get you all in here tonight. But nonetheless, I'm glad we're here together, and I'd like to take a few minutes of your valuable time and talk about something that I think is important to all of us. And inspired because I'm looking around this room and I see everything that you would ever want to see after 39 years of service. And that is an incredible mixture of those who have served, those who are serving, former shipmates of mine. The loyal toast tonight from a shipmate, Doc Hatton, and I, who sailed together a long time ago. One of the people I went through training with, who I haven't literally seen in probably 20 years, Buck, at least 36 years, who's here tonight because somebody bought him dinner. But nonetheless, I look around the room and I see all the young from York and elsewhere, and by York I mean HMCS, not the university, although I've got nothing against the university. I just like HMCS better. And it's just a great mix of people who've all come together for those 2-for-1 drink coupons that I was referring to earlier. So what would I like to say to you tonight? Well, I stand here as one of those now, many retired officers, very concerned. I stand here concerned about not only the institution that those who wear the uniform are still part of, but I stand here concerned because I genuinely believe, and this is my opinion, but I'm not ashamed of it, I believe that as a country, we are failing to genuinely appreciate what is happening in the world around us, what the implications are to this country, and how we as a nation should be preparing for the decades ahead, specifically as it relates to security and defense. I'm so pleased that we have such a great mix of folks in the room, as Chai pointed out. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge not just the head table and Brian, who has endured one of my speeches once already in Ottawa, and I'm not sure if he's a glutton for punishment or he's here to check my notes. Leona Alsev, Leona, having you here, it's fantastic to see you here. And as I said to you privately, and I'll say it publicly, I'm just so proud of the fact that you're in the House of Commons as a great caucus of veterans who understand and not only are appreciative of, but are truly enthusiastic about the armed forces and veterans. And I know that you will share some of the views that I'm going to express tonight about concerns about the security of this great country. Yeah, please. Brian, all joking aside, I think you're worthy of this acknowledgement. It takes a lot of courage to do what you did, to put yourself out there in a very public and vulnerable way, and to stand up and make a statement. And I respect you for having done that, and I respect you even more for having made the decision that you did. And I, notwithstanding the fact that you're not going to be in the fight, I know you're going to be in the fight, and you're a great Canadian, and it's truly an honor to have met you. So thank you. Yeah. So folks, my wife Bev, who's here with me tonight and has been with me through this whole ordeal, said to me on the train this morning as we left Ottawa, so what are you going to talk about? And I said, I'm not really sure. And she said, well, don't you think you should really think about it and maybe make some notes? So I spent the next 2.5 to 3 of the 4-hour train ride from Ottawa to Toronto making a bunch of notes, which are on my iPad. I can show them to you later. But I'm not sure they really matter. As much as I did it to formulate my own thoughts, I want to talk about a few things in the context of this concern. And I don't believe it's a personal concern. I believe it is a shared concern. And I'd just like to walk you through why I think we need, as Canadians, to do a better job of paying attention to security and defense as a set of issues facing this country. And I believe that the quality of debate and discussion in this country around security and defense is woefully inadequate. I believe that it is punctuated by episodic curiosity around issues that cover the spectrum of troop deployments to procurement issues to scandals inside the institution to perhaps a legal case around a senior naval officer to whatever the issue is of the day, but they do not sustain a degree of intellectual and professional curiosity that I think is warranted given where we are today in the world we find ourselves in. We, for a variety of reasons, and it's completely understandable and it's defensible, we are not particularly good at predicting the future. Who would have imagined the events of the last few weeks? I'm sure some would take credit for having predicted such things, but those individuals would be rare, and the mass or the mainstream community at large, even if they were paying attention, would not have predicted those events as much as they would have predicted similar events over the last several decades. The reality is that we find ourselves in a rapidly evolving and changing world, a global security situation which is increasingly challenging and one for which I believe this nation is unprepared. And I say that not as a criticism of those who serve. In fact, to the contrary. The greatest honor of my life has been to serve alongside the incredible men and women of the Armed Forces of Canada and our allies. But the problem is much deeper than that. It is much more complicated than that. And my view of this, strangely, has not changed significantly since I joined at the age of 17, but it has become better informed. Now, my perspective is one of a practitioner. I am not an academic, I'm not an intellectual. I'm somebody who spent 39 years in uniform doing the business to the best of my ability. And I have seen the sausage making that is defense in this country up close and personally. And I'm here to tell you that it is of concern. I'm not an alarmist, it's not my nature. I just believe that we need to start paying closer attention not only to what's going on inside the guardrails, that's a nautical term, inside our own country, but also what's going on around the world. And why this matters to Canada should be obvious to us, but it's not necessarily intuitively obvious to others. And I don't expect the average Canadian to have an appreciation for issues of security and defense. I don't think it's their responsibility. I don't think they should be expected to understand it or even to be aware of it. In fact, we have the luxury of living in an amazing country where we don't really have those challenges. But I do expect that the leadership, the political class of this country would understand better and prepare the nation better for what I am concerned is coming down the pipe. I believe that for the longest time as Canadians, we have taken a values-based approach to our place in the world and our position as it relates to issues that are transpiring around us. And you know, that's admirable. And Maslow would tell us, if we look at the hierarchy of needs, that those are at or near the pinnacle of that hierarchy, and that is a higher sense of accomplishment, and that we should all be proud of that as Canadians. And we should. But the practicality of the situation is that there are far more basic problems manifesting themselves, and we're seeing the symptoms of them on a day-to-day basis. And as I've said, I don't think we're properly prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. We have a difficult time in this country talking about our interests. And by that I don't mean parochial interests, I don't mean personal interests, I don't mean agendas, I mean national interests. At the absolute highest and strategic level, we have a very difficult time defining, we have a difficult time defining who we are as Canadians, but we can talk around that issue from a values perspective. When it comes to what our interests are and why they matter to us, we have real difficulty, and that transcends into the problems specifically of how we deal with security and defense issues going forward. This is important because this defines the context in which we see the world around us. And if we can't come to grips with or have informed and non-confrontational discussions and debates about what our interests are, then we can't actually respond properly to what's happening. And as I look at what could happen in the future, recognizing that none of us in this room, me included and especially, are able to predict the future, we can, however, draw conclusions or make assumptions or make deductions about the kinds of things that are happening that could be problematic for us as a nation. And as we sort of take a quick swath around the world and we look at the potential isolation and withdrawal of the United States as it relates to its international obligations and responsibilities and the role that it has traditionally played as a leader around the world. And I'm not interested in who's in the White House, okay? I believe that this is more fundamental than that. I believe it transcends the personality of an individual president. I believe that this is part of where the United States is going. Whether they want to go there or not, it's happening. As we look at the enigma that is the Middle East and the continued challenges associated with that, as we look to the Indo-Asia Pacific region and all the emerging power of China, the emerging challenges of that region, as we look at the challenges around the commitment of NATO, as we look at the issues around climate change, as we look at all of these issues going forward, they all present to us challenging and arguably irreconcilable potential for conflict, potential for the major powers, minor powers, issues around the future of democracy. All these things are playing into a really messy mix, a Gordian knot, if you will, that defines the strategic environment of the 21st century. And this is the context in which Canada needs to figure out who we want to be and how we want to behave. And it needs to be more than values-based virtue signaling. It needs to be substantive, it needs to be tangible, and I am concerned that we will potentially be isolated more and more as our major ally to the south does their own thing, and our NATO allies, who've traditionally always been together, are starting to wonder about their own futures and their own security. And I'm not saying for a moment that there's a boogeyman under the bed, okay? That's not who I am. I'm just saying that we need to start really seriously thinking about these things, and we need to start having more sophisticated conversations about what those potential implications are going forward. I suggested to Mike the notion of looking forward. When, like many naval officers in the room, I've told this story in Ottawa, so I apologize to Brian and Scott and a few others who've heard it. When you first arrive on the bridge of a ship, you're confronted with many things. But one of the first things you're taught is keep your head up and keep your eyes forward. Look out the windows. Now that may seem like an obvious thing to say for non-sailors. Of course you'd look out the windows. But there's a bunch of other things that go on the bridge, including the navigation of the ship, which is a distraction from looking out the bridge windows. And this idea of eyes forward, eyes out the bridge windows resonates with me as it does every other naval officer in the room. In my particular case, however, I failed at this quite significantly very early in my career. And as a result, a very good friend of mine who was training me at the time and I put a small patrol boat of Her Majesty's Canadian Navy on a sandbar in the middle of the St. Lawrence River because we were not looking out the bridge windows. We were focused on the chart. And we had a very good sense of where we were 3 or 4 minutes ago, but we had lost the bubble, as we say, in terms of where we actually were. And where we were supposed to have red buoys on one side and green buoys on the other, we didn't. And the next thing we heard was a very, very disturbing kind of slushy grinding sound. And the engineer came running up yelling at us because the intakes were all full of sand. Luckily it was sand and the bottom of the ship was in better shape than it had ever been. But nonetheless, it was a valuable lesson in looking forward and not looking back. We are informed by our past. We are informed by our history. This very institute represents the best of military history in Canada, and we should be proud of that. And we should celebrate that. But we can't allow ourselves to be distracted by that. And we need to look at the challenges of the future through a different set of eyes and through a different lens. Einstein is known for many quotes, and the most appropriate in this context is, you can't, and I'm paraphrasing, you can't solve problems by taking the same thought process that got you into the problem in the first place. And so I'm here to basically say to you, we need a new approach. We need a new and better informed debate and discussion around defense in Canada. And in the context of keeping our eyes forward but knowing where we are, I believe we're actually in a good place, but we're in a very fragile place. The institution that is national defense and the Canadian Forces is struggling. They will not tell you they are struggling for a variety of reasons, including professional pride and political rhetoric. But the bottom line is, the institution is struggling. And it's not struggling because it doesn't have great people. It's struggling because of a whole variety of other factors which are just coming together in time and space and making life extremely difficult. And a lot of that has to do with money. A lot of that has to do with fixed costs, which are rapidly growing and consuming the available resources. A lot of it has to do with process. A lot of it has to do with challenges related to human resources. There are a variety of reasons. There is not a lack of enthusiasm inside the guardrails, inside the institution, but as a former senior officer, I can tell you that you very quickly get yourself into trouble when you stand up publicly and describe the realities of the situation that the institution is facing. And they need our help. They won't ask for it for the reasons that I just mentioned. But the institution needs our help. And beyond just the institution, the nation needs our help. I believe that in the months and years ahead, institutions like RCMI and others can play a vital role in helping inform and shape this improved debate and discussion around issues of defense and security. I'm not putting RCMI on the spot. There are a lot of others out there, but I believe part of the way forward is that we need to establish a community of practice around the discussions of defense and security. And it needs to be a multidisciplinary community that brings in the best of all of the different interested parties, from academia to practitioners, and it needs to be open and transparent. It needs to be supported, and it needs to be given the airtime necessary. All of those are challenges, and I don't deny any one of them as being a difficult challenge on their own to overcome. But I believe that the nation needs this. It needs it now, because we can't afford to wait for what I fear is going to be a security crisis for which we are woefully unprepared, notwithstanding the great work of the men and women who work in uniform every day in this country. Thank you very much. That's my rant, and I would be delighted to take your questions, which I know is unusual for a mess dinner, but I've agreed to do so. And over to you and Brian. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Admiral. I'd like to remind...
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.